I was born into a house where love was a ration, and I was the wrong mouth. No one said it outright. That's not how families like mine do cruelty. They distribute it in chores and silences, in corrections made too sharply, and praise withheld like air. If I had been the only child, maybe my parents would have had to face the shape of their own affection. But there were three of us, which meant they could organize us like furniture. Adrian, the eldest, was the heir apparent, a son with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the magical talent of doing little and being rewarded for it. Sophia, the youngest, was the darling small, theatrical, a magnet for adults who enjoyed being charmed by small tyrants. I was the middle, which in our house translated to ballast. I held the weight that kept the family upright. When things tipped, they handed me more. My father called this raising a man. My mother called it teaching responsibility. When I washed dishes at 10, while Adrian played video games so loud the floor hummed, I was learning to pitch in. When I studied at the kitchen table, Sophia would demand markers and space, and my mother would say, "Be a sweetie and move, wash. Your sister needs the whole table for her project." My birthdays were chores with candles. Adrian's birthdays were events, all noise and cake and guests and photos that lived on the fridge until the magnets lost their grip. If I asked why the rules bent around them, my mother said, "Why do you count favors like a cashier? Do good because it's good." My father would add, "Your brother and sister have different needs," as if I were selfish for not inventing more. The first time I learned what it meant to be the family's floor was a winter morning when I was 11 and a science fair project went missing. I had built a model bridge out of toothpicks, a ridiculous thing that I was nonetheless proud of because I'd tested its load with pennies and it held more than Adrian said it would. I left it on the counter so the glue could sleep. In the morning, it was gone. My father found it in the trash, bent, and asked why I'd thrown it away. I told him I hadn't. He looked at Adrian, who shrugged, and at Sophia, who feigned an innocence so pure angels would have signed it. My mother cut in. "Maybe you forgot pushing it aside when you were cleaning." She gave me a rag. "Wipe the counters. Work first, sulking later." I rebuilt something smaller, and got an honorable mention, and watched Adrian win for a volcano he hadn't bothered to paint. On the car ride home, my father told me to clap for my brother because he's still your family. I learned that day that in our house, truth was a guest who needed an invitation, and I wasn't the one with the pen. There were 100 variations of that lesson, the lost permission slip that my mother couldn't find until the day after the trip, the accidental erasure of a recording I needed for a language class, the time Adrian wrecked the old sedan by backing into a hydrant, and my father made me call the insurance company because you explain things better, which meant, if it goes wrong, I want it to be your voice on the record. I worked. They played. I kept the ledger in my head because I was a boy who learned young that numbers don't lie even when people do. High school was a stretch of asphalt. I ran as fast as I could. I got a job at the grocery store, bagging even though the shifts were late, and my father mocked the idea of scraps for paychecks. I saved, I studied, I stayed out of the house as much as possible. When my guidance counselor called my parents to say I was in the running for a scholarship, my mother listened politely and then asked whether Adrian's college could bundle sibling aid. Adrian's GPA had all the ambition of a sleeping cat. He received an acceptance to a state school that asked nothing more of him than a pulse and a deposit. I was accepted to a better one. My father said, "Don't get a big head," like good news had weight, and he didn't want to carry it. There was a college fund my grandparents had started when we were small, a modest account that would help whoever needed it most. "We'll divide it fairly," my mother said. "We're not monsters." The summer after graduation, Adrian got a car. Not new, new enough. The plate came from my father's hands like a blessing. "It's from the fund," my mother explained when I asked how. "We want all of you to have what you need. You have a scholarship. Your brother needs wheels for work." Adrian's first job lasted 8 weeks. The car lasted 2 years and a tree. Sophia received a study abroad in her senior year of high school. The kind of program for students whose parents liked throwing around words like enrichment. The fund paid for the fee, the flight, and the wardrobe my mother called necessary for Europe. When I pointed at the remaining balance and my fall tuition gap, my father said, "You're the smart one. You'll figure it out." I did. It turns out figure it out is what people say to the family donkey. You can load it with anything, and when it staggers under the weight, you call it stubborn instead of broken. I went to college with 2 suitcases, $3,000, and a stubbornness they couldn't see anymore. I worked nights at the campus library, mornings in the coffee shop. I ate too much pasta and learned which apples are cheapest per pound in October. I built a life that had no room for my family, except as a number on my caller ID that I learned to let ring. They rang anyway. My mother called when the printer broke because you know computers. My father called when a bill arrived that made him mad, and he wanted someone to hear him shout without shouting at himself. Adrian called when he needed money or a ride or an alibi. Sophia called to cry about a professor who didn't think her panic was cute. I answered, not always, enough. Guilt is a muscle. If you don't stretch it, it tightens. I found my place in a field that rewarded the habits my family had beaten into me. Forensic accounting. People hear accounting and think gray. They don't know how much heat numbers can hold when they explode in the right light. I learned to read ledgers like diaries. I learned how a miscategorized expense tells a story. How cash bleeds when someone's favorite nephew loves a blackjack table. How a charity becomes a photo op when a board member forgets to count the envelopes. I learned to document without flinching. I learned to make memos that made men twice my age sweat. In my senior year, my father asked me to help with the books for the family business. He had gone from a mechanic to the owner of a small repair shop that had grown into a modest garage with 4 bays and a reputation for fair deals, which in our town translated to, the owner knows the right people. He said he couldn't justify paying a real accountant, so if I could check the numbers, he'd appreciate it. I told myself this was the olive branch I'd always wanted. It wasn't. It was a rope. I should have recognized the knots. The books were a parade of sins disguised as shortcuts. Cash that didn't exist according to the bank that paid the mortgage. Employees who were family members on paper and ghosts on the floor. Cash sales that disappeared into the kind of petty fog that becomes a storm if you throw a match. I wrote a memo. I suggested ways to clean it up without burning the place down. My father read it and said, "You think you know better than me about my own business?" My mother said, "Don't make this about blame. We all do what we can." Adrian, whose name appeared as consultant on checks he didn't remember endorsing, laughed. "You always loved rules," he said, as if I had suggested we all sleep in shoes. The shop wasn't the only thing crooked. My mother had a social life made of church functions, fundraisers, committees with words like auxiliary in them. She was the woman who could throw a gala with borrowed centerpieces and applause measured in heavy platters, returning to a kitchen at midnight. She liked to be photographed with microphones and checks. I found a photo of her presenting a novelty check to a scholarship fund that had never written me a note, and a number under the photo that didn't match the ledger in the charity's filings online. If I had been a generous man, I would have called it an error. I was not generous anymore. The day I realized how far they'd go to keep me in their idea of family was the day a letter arrived at my apartment, addressed to me, but the envelope in my mother's handwriting. She had written to my landlord, pretending to be me, asking for clarification on the lease terms for additional tenants. She was testing whether she could move my brother in for a few months while he gets back on his feet. My landlord brought it to me with a look that said he had his own mother and he knew this trick. I laughed exactly once, not because it was funny, but because my body needed a sound that wasn't a scream. I wrote back to my mother in a tone of ice, "Never do that again." She replied with a paragraph about family and loyalty and how I'd forgotten who fed me when I had no teeth. The last time I let them use me was when Sophia called crying because she'd, accidentally, missed the deadline to withdraw from a class and needed to pay to retake it. She said, "You're the only dependable one." And I heard what she meant. You're the only one who can be counted on to set yourself on fire to keep us warm. I wired money I didn't have because the muscle memory of being the floor is strong. Then I sat on my couch and realized there would never be enough money, enough apologizing, enough patience to fill the hole they had dug and named love. People think revenge requires a spark. Mine needed a blueprint. I didn't want a scene at a dinner or a Facebook post that would get 100 comments from people who like throwing stones in glass houses where nobody knows their middle names. I wanted a structure that collapsed without my fingerprints on every beam. I wanted them to feel gravity. The first beam was information. Families like mine survive on secrets and illusions. My father's tax filings were under a CPA's signature I recognized from a panel discussion on helping small businesses thrive. The CPA was sloppy in ways that suggested he liked having clients who were sloppier. I gathered copies of invoices that didn't match the entries. I scanned checks written to cash and traced the withdrawals. I took photos of things like a new lift installed in the shop without a permit sticker anywhere near it. I kept a log of employees' hours as reported on the whiteboard in the office and the hours reported in the payroll system. I collected receipts from the donation bins my mother controlled at church and compared them to deposits. Nothing dramatic, just little skims, a birthday cake here, a dress there, a catering order put on charity paper. I didn't shout. I moved emails and copies into folders, named sanely, backed up twice. The second beam was patience. There is a kind of justice that only works if you wait for the right weight to land on the right point. My father decided he wanted to expand into a fifth bay and took out a loan. The bank loved him because he had 20 years of relationships and a jaw men shook hands with. He leveraged the building. He changed insurers to save a few thousand. He called me so I could be proud. I said I was happy for him and under my breath thanked him for adding a lender, a regulator, and an insurer to the list of people who now had reasons to care about what happened inside his walls. The third beam was telling the truth to people who could use it. I filed a whistleblower report with the State Labor Department about misclassification and unpaid overtime at the shop. Not anonymous, those get buried. Documented, calm, with exhibits, the way a surgeon wants a chart. I reported the unpermitted equipment to the city's building authority with photos that showed model numbers, serials, and the absence of a permit number. I sent a package to the state's tax enforcement arm with discrepancies in sales tax remittance and a spreadsheet that did the math, because I know how underfunded offices choose which cases to pursue. They chase the fraud that has already been solved by the complainant. I sent a memo to the shop's insurer about non-compliant safety procedures observed during public hours. Lines of cars backed into the sidewalk, employees without proper PPE, using lifts after hours. I didn't lie in any line. I didn't exaggerate. Truth, in sufficient quantity, is acid. If you've never watched a family's social life deflate, you might mistake it for bad weather. It starts with fewer invitations to the kind of events where my mother loved standing near a microphone. It continues with whispered questions about the situation at the shop. It accelerates the day the labor investigator visits and takes 3 employees into a side room and leaves the office with a pile of documents and a schedule for a return. It gets loud when the building inspector red tags a lift. It becomes visible when an auditor's request for 2 years of transaction detail lands in the CPA's inbox and he stops taking my father's calls. Emotions don't move these things. Paper does. I watched the paper move and made more. My parents reacted the way all small tyrants do under pressure. They tried to exert more control where they could. My father left me voicemails about family betrayers. My mother used phrases like, "After all we've done for you," and "blood." I didn't respond to either. Adrian tried a different route. He put his hand on my shoulder at a barbecue he had not prepared and called me bro with a weight that once would have made me weak. "What's with the crusade?" he asked. "You think you're going to save the world?" He smiled the smirk he'd used on teachers who asked for late work. I said, "I'm saving me," and walked away. The shop bled money in tiny red threads that became a rope around my father's throat. He cut hours. He cut corners. He complained about the government, like a child scolded for playing with matches near gasoline. The bank, once friendly, stopped using first names. The insurer raised premiums, after a surprise inspection, found exactly what I had told them to look for. The city issued a fine. The state demanded back pay and penalties. The CPA resigned. This is the part where a kinder story would have me soften. I didn't. Nobody softened for me when I asked for the college fund to be used for college. Sophia's turn arrived like a car she hadn't looked for before crossing the street. She had carved a career out of being charming and connected, which in our town meant a job in a nonprofit that liked photos and checks and events where people could wear suits to feel useful. She had a leadership role she hadn't earned beyond her name and her mother's pedigree among the people who serve quiche on silver. I sent 3 emails to her board, one with receipts from personal dinners charged to the organization's card, one with copies of sponsorship invoices altered to hide discounts given to friends, and one with HR complaints from 2 staffers whose names I kept off the screen, but whose language I had helped make legal enough to stick. I didn't add commentary. I let policy do the talking. The board hired a firm to review internal controls. Sophia called it a witch hunt and cried to my mother, who called me to say I was jealous of a girl who actually made something of herself. I saved the voicemail and added it to a folder titled Narratives. Adrian was easier. Men like him hang themselves. He had a gambling problem he called a hobby. He had a side business that was a side. In the way a wall is a side, it held nothing up. He ran a resale game with salvaged parts from the shop and ran it on credit he had no intention of honoring. I didn't need to do more than copy emails he sent to suppliers with promises he didn't meet and forward them to a group of small business owners who had, historically, loved my father and tolerated his son. A supplier filed a civil suit. Another went to the police. My father yelled about loyalty. Adrian threatened to handle me. I bought a deadbolt for my apartment door and told nobody about it. The collapse wasn't cinematic. There was no scene where all the people I had armed with truth faced my parents in a single hall and read the list of charges while they looked for exits. It was quieter and meaner. It was Sunday afternoon visits where my mother's circle shrank. It was Thursday mornings at the shop with a city inspector's car parked out front and the regulars driving past because they didn't want their plates in the background of someone else's trouble. It was late-night emails from Sophia's board chair asking how to phrase an administrative leave in a way that didn't humiliate a young woman who had enjoyed humiliation as a hobby. It was Adrian's girlfriend leaving a box of his clothes on the porch and texting me, not him. I know what he's done. I hope you get free. Free is a strange word when your freedom is built with the bricks of your family's disgrace. It doesn't feel clean. It feels like a house you're allowed to stay in because you can pay the mortgage. But the last owners left their smell. Then came the begging, which we both know is what you came to hear. Cruelty isn't satisfied by damage. It wants the petition. I didn't plan the petition. It arrived like a holiday only the desperate celebrate. My father called first, not angry this time, just tired. We need to talk, he said, Misha. Man to man. He had always loved that phrase. It made him feel like gender was a permission slip. I met him at the shop because I wanted geography on my side. The bays were quiet, tools hung like witnesses. He sat on a rolling stool and didn't make it roll, which told me more than any sentence he'd ever deployed. You're smart, he said. Smarter than me. You know how to fix this. I already tried to, I said. 3 years ago. I wrote a memo. You laughed. That was different, he said. And then, as if he'd rehearsed the line and couldn't stand not to say it, you don't betray your blood. You taught me that the first time you put your brother's ticket under my name, I said. You taught me that blood is a word you say when you want something for free. He asked for a loan. He asked me to call the bank. He asked me to make the city back off. He asked as if I were a universal remote, and he had forgotten which button did which. I told him I didn't control regulators or banks, and I wasn't his wallet. He lowered his voice and said, son. And I felt something cold and clean pass through me like a weather front. Don't call me that, I said. You liked the word when it made me quiet. It doesn't work anymore. I left him in the bay with his tools and his pride and his debts. And as I walked past the front counter, I saw the stack of invoices with red stamps, and smiled once, a private thing, because paper had done what fists never could. My mother came next, with a script she'd perfected in living rooms, with crystal bowls. She wanted to host me. She wanted to serve tea. She wanted, above all, to orchestrate the scene. I met her at a diner instead. She wore a blouse that had seen better days and a perfume that had seen better rooms. She held my hand across Formica and said, "I don't know what's happening to us." I said, "We're being measured." She dabbed at her eyes with a napkin and said she was disappointed in the tone I'd taken with the family. I asked her if she was disappointed when she forged my handwriting on a landlord letter, or disappointed when she skimmed from a charity meant to pay for other people's chemistry books. She tried a different key. We were scared, we always were, about money, about being small. Then she reached for history. When you were a baby, you had colic. I held you for hours. You would cry, and I still held you. People think telling baby stories brings people back into arms. I told her, that was your job, and watched her flinch like I'd cursed. She asked me for introductions to donors who could believe in Sophia again. I told her credibility doesn't transfer like a check. She asked me to help put the family back together. I said, I'm not glue, and paid the bill. Sophia texted me a paragraph with 5 exclamation points, and then deleted it, and sent another with 1 period, and it hurt more. I made mistakes, she wrote. I'm trying to fix them. You of all people should understand what it's like to be judged by people who don't know you. I started to type, and erased the sentence 6 times before I sent. You were judged by policy you signed. Fixing it looks like living with the consequences. She wrote a while later, Adrian says you're enjoying this. I wrote, Adrian doesn't know what enjoyment is without someone else paying for it. She replied with a crying face. I didn't answer. There are conversations you don't owe a reply. Adrian showed up at my door once, drunk enough to cry and brave enough to knock. I didn't let him in. He stood on the landing and delivered a speech to the hallway about brothers and loyalty and how we came from the same woman, man. Like biology was a debit card, and I was the machine denying him cash. He asked for 5,000, and when I said no, he asked for 500, and when I said no, he asked for 50, and when I said no, he called me a sociopath, like a man throwing words at a wall to see which one sticks. I closed the door. He texted me an hour later, "You'll regret it when Dad is gone, and you have no one." I put the phone face down and slept. This is the part where the cruelty you requested lives. Not in shouting, not in spectacle, in stillness, in choosing not to move when those who moved you, like furniture, ask for you to be a lever again. They begged. I did nothing. It is harder than it sounds, and easier than anyone prepared to hate me will admit. You need to undevelop a reflex. You need to let silence be the answer. You need to sit on your hands when they ask you for the thing your hands were raised to provide. You need to let a small tyrant learn what it feels like when the room no longer turns, when he clears his throat. I could end here, and you would feel satisfied in a way that would make me suspect you of never having sat in the kitchen with someone who taught you to be smaller and then blamed you for not being large enough to carry them. But the collapse had another axis, their social world. The people my mother had served for decades are not villains. They are, like most humans, allergic to accountability when it might splash on their shoes. They retreated, not because I sent them away, but because the kind of shame that follows fines and leave of absence memos is contagious. My parents found their phones quieter. They found their pew less crowded. They found the local paper less interested in printing their names. My mother called to tell me no one had asked her to chair the spring gala, and I swallowed 1,000 old hungers to tell her I had read the finance reports from previous years and knew exactly why. I didn't say it. I didn't need to. The choir they used to conduct had found a new director. The shop closed, not overnight. The insurer canceled after the second inspection found conditions uncorrected. The city revoked the license after the third administrative hearing. The bank called the note. My father sold the lifts and the air compressor and the old fridge where I'd hidden soda cans as a teenager and said to a neighbor, "We're moving on to bigger things." Like narrative could keep the door open. They lost the building. They found a rental in a strip that used to be a florist. Their sign didn't look the same under cheaper bulbs. Their old customers went to the chain down the road because you can't sell nostalgia to an engine. Sophia resigned to focus on family. The board hired a director who had a degree in what my sister had pretended to do. The donors gave in gratitude for years of service, and then gave again to the new guard with strict earmarks. My mother joined a smaller auxiliary and arranged flowers at funerals. Her hands were always good at making things seem tender. Adrian took a job at a different shop, farther away, smaller, because he needed a place where nobody knew his name yet. He lasted until the first time he didn't show up on a Friday after betting too big on a Thursday. He moved back in with my parents. He posted a photo of the three of them on a couch that had known better afternoons and captioned it, "Fam, no matter what." And I scrolled past without the little spasm of envy that had once been my private addiction. And me, I didn't profit from their ruin directly. I didn't want their house. I didn't buy their debt. That would be a different story about a different man. I moved apartments to a place with better light and a longer walk to the train. I put photos on my walls that I chose. I bought a kettle that boiled water without screaming. I went to work and did my job and said no to clients who wanted me to bless what they were trying to hide. I slept. Not well at first, better later. Years have a way of making people polite. Grief taught my parents a set of manners they had never learned when power made the rules. They sent me holiday cards, signed with both names and one sentence about weather. I replied with brief notes about work and the fact that my basil kept dying because I watered it too much. They didn't ask for money in those notes. They didn't hint heavily. They knew the door had closed, and they wanted at least to keep the window. The last time we stood in a room together where begging might have worked was a Sunday afternoon after my aunt's birthday. They cornered me in the kitchen, which is where all important conversations occur in our family, because the living room is for performance. My father looked small in a way that frightened me, because he had never been small, and I had built my whole scaffold on the architecture of his size. My mother touched my sleeve and said, "We're thinking of moving. We can't afford the house." I knew. I'd looked up the public records without meaning to, and then meaning to, and then refusing to pretend. "We were wondering," she said, "if you might help us with a deposit for a new place." She rushed the next words, as if speed could carry them past my ears. "Just a loan." I let the silence sit between us like a full sink. Then I said, "No." My mother blinked, as if I'd knocked a glass out of her hand. My father said softly, "We're not asking for the world." I said, "You already have." My mother started to cry. My father didn't. He looked at me the way people look at a man leaving a room they thought he would always clean. He opened his mouth to say "son," and closed it again. My mother rubbed at her eyes and said, "You'll regret this one day." I said, "I already regret what I gave you." I left the kitchen before I could become the man who comforts the people who taught him to be everyone's comfort as a way of keeping him from asking for anything. Cruelty is often confused with clarity by people who have never had to choose against a reflex that kept them alive. I don't think of myself as cruel. I think of myself as finally, precisely fair. I gave them nothing when they asked for everything with the same mouth they used to call me ungrateful. I did nothing when they begged me to be the lever that moved their world again. I stood still and let gravity do the work. It did. They moved. A smaller place, one bathroom, a porch that looks out at a street with more parked cars than flowers. They still have each other. That's not nothing. They have Adrian, who will always be a boy who thinks any room is his until the room says no. They have Sophia, who eventually married a man who liked her laughter and knew enough to keep her away from budgets. They have church on Sundays. They have an oven that doesn't close all the way, and a neighbor who brings tomatoes. They have the ability to call me and tell me about the tomatoes. I don't answer every time. I answer enough. If you came here for a speech about forgiveness, I can't give it. Forgiveness is work I might do privately on a day when the light hits the table right and I feel strong enough to put my hands in the old water. It is not a service I provide to people who only ever learn to say sorry as a spell to return things to the way they prefer. When they begged, I did nothing. When they ask now, I choose when the word no is an act of maintenance, like mowing a lawn. Every once in a while, I pass the old shop. It's a yoga studio now. Someone painted the bays white and hung plants by the windows. The parking lot is full of cars that don't leak. I stand across the street and listen for ghosts. I hear none. Somewhere, in a drawer in my apartment, there is a memo I wrote at 21 to a man who could have changed everything with a few signatures and a willingness to be small for a minute. I keep it not as proof I was right, but as a reminder that you can offer people ladders and they will call them insults if they're busy practicing how to fall with dignity. I don't tell this story because I want applause. I tell it because endings matter. People like my parents rarely get the ending they warn their children about. They don't die alone in a cold house. They live, smaller, with the people who chose them when they had nothing to hand out but stories. They live long enough to sit in kitchens that don't look like theirs and ask for a loan. They live long enough to learn that the child they raised to hold weight cannot be bent anymore into a bridge. That's a cruelty they earned. That's a kindness I kept for myself. If a younger version of me is reading, the one standing by the trash, while a model bridge bends in a way that tells you how the next decade will go, hear me. You are not furniture. Your value does not depend on how quietly you carry other people's weight. Document everything. Save what's yours. Build slowly. Then, when they come to you at the end, when they lower their voices and remember your first name, when they call you family like an incantation, do nothing. Stand there. Let gravity do what it does. Walk out of the kitchen with your spine intact and go home to the life you built without their hands.